Glacium 6 was not on any tourist brochure. It had no sun, no cities, no colors but gray-blue ice and the perpetual storm front that swept its frozen plains. A rogue planet, untethered from a star, adrift in the black between galaxies. And yet it breathed. Faint signals pulsed beneath its crust, the kind that made science teams whisper and generals lean forward. The HFY Kenosha pierced the upper atmosphere like a falling star that forgot its fire. Inside, the first human expedition team to land on Glacium 6 readied for deployment. Their breath clouded in the recycled air despite internal heating. The cold was already seeping into their bones, as if the planet itself had opinions. Commander Ray adjusted her thermal visor, watching as frost laced the viewport from outside. Atmosphere stable, oxygen negligible, temperature impressive, she said with a forced chuckle. Minus 150 Celsius and dropping. Good day for a stroll. The others laughed nervously. The humor was ritual, an ancient human shield against the unknown. Then the dropship hatch groaned open, and the cold hit them like a presence. It wasn't just freezing, it was alive. The kind of cold that whispered, that listened back. The team fanned out, scanners raised. Snow hissed sideways across the barren ground, shaped by winds with no origin. Visibility was low, and the silence, even through suit audio, was disconcerting. Still nothing on bio readings, muttered Dr. Kim, their xenobiologist. But I'm getting flickers, not movement exactly, more like echoes. Ray frowned. Echoes of what? Kim hesitated. Us, but distorted, delayed, almost like they're reflecting us. As the team established a base, temporary shelters, geothermal drills, sensor beacons, the sense of being watched grew impossible to dismiss. Cameras picked up subtle distortions in the distance. Shapes, tall, narrow, motionless. Look at this, said Engineer Patel, pointing to a drone feed. A figure stood in the blizzard, maybe 200 meters from the base. Thin, jagged, like a sculpture grown rather than built. No visible eyes, no movement. Just watching. Ray zoomed in. The thing shimmered slightly as if the storm bent around it. Could be ice formations, Kim offered. Ice formations don't move, Ray replied. Because when they checked again, the figure was gone. By the fourth day, the team had cataloged nearly a dozen instances. No aggressive behavior. No attempts at communication. Just the watchers, appearing at the periphery of human activity, never approaching, never retreating. They came with the wind and vanished with the silence. The team's sleep grew restless. Equipment occasionally glitched, no damage, just rewired. One morning, Ray's HUD display began mirroring her past conversations. Another night, their fire pit glowed blue despite burning standard fuel. This place doesn't want us dead, Patel said, but it's testing us, watching how we live, how we warm ourselves. Kim stared out into the swirling storm. Or remembering. On day 6, the first contact came, not with words, with a breath. A young technician, Harlan, wandered too far from the thermal fence. They found him 20 minutes later, standing still, helmet fogged from the inside. When they reached him, he spoke only one sentence. It showed me a funeral in the snow. The team thought hypothermia, but his vitals were fine. He described images that hadn't been captured on any feed. Crystalline beings gathered in a circle, their bodies emitting soft heat, mourning the death of one of their own by standing silent for 3 days. Kim listened, pale. That's memory transmission, not hallucination. Something put that in his head. Ray turned to the open plain beyond the base. A dozen watchers stood at the ridge now, close, still unmoving. Then they want us to see, she whispered. They want us to remember, too. And somewhere deep below the ice, something ancient, stirred. The Icelorn had noticed the firebringers, and they had not turned away. The snowstorm cleared like a breath held too long, revealing the contours of a horizon not made of stone, but of stillness. Commander Ray stood on the observation deck of Outpost Verity, sipping coffee that had gone cold too fast. Beyond the reinforced glass, the plains of Glaxium 6 stretched endlessly, a canvas of wind-scoured ice, shifting faintly under an aurora that barely reached the ground. The temperature sensors blinked in warning, but Ray had stopped noticing them. Her focus was on the shapes that had emerged from the storm. They stood 100 meters out, tall and unmoving. At first glance, they resembled columns of ice, natural, accidental, perhaps statues shaped by the wind. But then one moved. Just a flicker. A tilt of a crown-like head, faceted like quartz. No one said a word in the control room. No one needed to. The feed spoke for itself. The Icelorn had arrived. They weren't creatures of flesh. Not in any traditional sense. Their forms shimmered subtly in the sub-zero light, translucent bodies pulsing with threads of inner frost, veins that glowed like frozen stars. They had no mouths, no eyes, no clear origin of speech. Yet something passed between them and the humans who watched. "They're communicating," whispered Lieutenant Harris, her voice fogging her mask. Ray nodded slowly. Not with sound, with heat? A sudden warmth passed through the command deck, a brief localized rise in temperature. The sensation wasn't random. It was shaped, patterned, Morse code without the dots, music without the notes. The science officer, Dr. Aldrin, muttered, "Not just heat. They're broadcasting memory." Emotive resonance mapped onto thermals. It's like they're sharing thoughts sculpted from how it felt to be them. Commander Ray furrowed her brow. How it felt. They don't speak in syntax, they speak in context. Experience. One of the Icelorn stepped forward, its limbs slow, movements elegant like glacial drift. As it moved, the snow underfoot didn't crunch. It folded, as if the planet itself welcomed them. Ray stepped outside. The cold hit like a hammer, but she pressed forward. The wind howled behind her. In front, only stillness. She stopped 10 meters from the leading Icelorn. No weapons, no threats, only presence. The air between them shimmered, slightly warmer. Ray felt it before she understood it. A memory, not hers, blooming in her mind. A vast silence. A war she didn't recognize, the shattering of suns. And then, exile. A choice made not in fear, but principle. The Icelorn had once spoken. Their words had burned across galaxies. But when their kind saw what their voices wrought, they fell into silence to remember, not to forget. And now they watched, always. Ray staggered back overwhelmed. Dr. Aldrin caught her. "They just showed me," she gasped, "their history. Not in images, in feeling. They've lived in memory so long they've become it." The Icelorn remained still. Waiting, not demanding, not judging, listening. Back inside, the humans debated what they'd seen. "They're alive," said Harris, "but not in any way the Dominion would recognize. We have to protect them." Dr. Aldrin agreed. "They're sapient, possibly post-verbal. We could spend a lifetime studying them and still miss the point." Commander Ray looked out the viewport again. The Icelorn hadn't moved, but the storm had begun to circle around them, as if nature itself acknowledged their gravity. She turned to her crew. "We treat them as equals, as elders, no force, no data mining, no pressure." "And if they don't want us here?" Harris asked. Ray took a breath, and for the first time since landing, she felt the chill in her bones begin to ebb. "Then we listen, and we leave." But deep inside, she sensed something else. The Icelorn had not come to warn, nor to beg. They had come because they'd heard something in the human landing. A sound not heard in centuries. Curiosity. They had come because they too were ready to speak again. And this time, they would not be alone. The snowstorm cleared like a breath held too long, revealing the contours of a horizon not made of stone, but of stillness. Commander Ray stood on the observation deck of Outpost Verity, sipping coffee that had gone cold too fast. Beyond the reinforced glass, the plains of Glaxium 6 stretched endlessly, a canvas of wind-scoured ice, shifting faintly under an aurora that barely reached the ground. The temperature sensors blinked in warning, but Ray had stopped noticing them. Her focus was on the shapes that had emerged from the storm. They stood 100 meters out, tall and unmoving. At first glance, they resembled columns of ice, natural, accidental, perhaps statues shaped by the wind. But then one moved. Just a flicker. A tilt of a crown-like head, faceted like quartz. No one said a word in the control room. No one needed to. The feed spoke for itself. The Icelorn had arrived. They weren't creatures of flesh. Not in any traditional sense. Their forms shimmered subtly in the sub-zero light, translucent bodies pulsing with threads of inner frost, veins that glowed like frozen stars. They had no mouths, no eyes, no clear origin of speech. Yet something passed between them and the humans who watched. "They're communicating," whispered Lieutenant Harris, her voice fogging her mask. Ray nodded slowly. Not with sound, with heat? A sudden warmth passed through the command deck, a brief localized rise in temperature. The sensation wasn't random. It was shaped, patterned. Morse code without the dots, music without the notes. The science officer, Dr. Aldrin, muttered, "Not just heat. They're broadcasting memory." Emotive resonance mapped onto thermals. It's like they're sharing thoughts sculpted from how it felt to be them. Commander Ray furrowed her brow. How it felt. They don't speak in syntax, they speak in context. Experience. One of the Icelorn stepped forward, its limbs slow, movements elegant like glacial drift. As it moved, the snow underfoot didn't crunch. It folded, as if the planet itself welcomed them. Ray stepped outside. The cold hit like a hammer, but she pressed forward. The wind howled behind her. In front, only stillness. She stopped 10 meters from the leading Icelorn. No weapons, no threats, only presence. The air between them shimmered, slightly warmer. Ray felt it before she understood it. A memory, not hers, blooming in her mind. A vast silence. A war she didn't recognize, the shattering of suns. And then, exile. A choice made not in fear, but principle. The Icelorn had once spoken. Their words had burned across galaxies. But when their kind saw what their voices wrought, they fell into silence to remember, not to forget. And now they watched, always. Ray staggered back overwhelmed. Dr. Aldrin caught her. "They just showed me," she gasped, "their history. Not in images, in feeling. They've lived in memory so long they've become it." The Icelorn remained still. Waiting, not demanding, not judging, listening. Back inside, the humans debated what they'd seen. "They're alive," said Harris, "but not in any way the Dominion would recognize. We have to protect them." Dr. Aldrin agreed. "They're sapient, possibly post-verbal. We could spend a lifetime studying them and still miss the point." Commander Ray looked out the viewport again. The Icelorn hadn't moved, but the storm had begun to circle around them, as if nature itself acknowledged their gravity. She turned to her crew. "We treat them as equals, as elders, no force, no data mining, no pressure." "And if they don't want us here?" Harris asked. Ray took a breath, and for the first time since landing, she felt the chill in her bones begin to ebb. "Then we listen, and we leave." But deep inside, she sensed something else. The Icelorn had not come to warn, nor to beg. They had come because they'd heard something in the human landing. A sound not heard in centuries. Curiosity. They had come because they too were ready to speak again. And this time, they would not be alone. Purpose. reveal Icelorn history and shared pain. The Icelorn share a memory vision. Once part of a galactic empire, they refused to wage war and were banished to freeze in isolation. They expected to die. Instead, they remembered, survived, evolved. The humans listen, not as conquerors, but as fellow survivors. The storm outside never stopped. Glossum 6 did not know weather as other planets did. It only knew variations of blizzard and silence. In the white dark, the storm curled like a sleeping beast. Inside the human forward shelter, the heating units hummed low, almost reverent. Commander Ray sat across from the Icelorn known only as Shiver That Remembers. The name hadn't been spoken. The Icelorn didn't speak. It had been felt, impressed into Ray's mind through a slow pulse of warmth against her palm when she'd pressed it to the being's crystalline surface. Their language was emotion, memory, temperature, translated through neural relays hastily adapted by the science team. "I think it wants to tell a story," said Dr. Mensa, voice hushed, reverent. He adjusted the relay's frequency. The room dimmed slightly as if bracing itself. The Icelorn stepped forward, its crystalline limbs folding with the grace of melting glass. It lowered its head toward the interface sphere, a small orb of repurposed tech designed to receive projected neural imprints. A low warmth passed through the humans like a phantom breeze. Suddenly, they were no longer in the shelter. They stood beneath a different sky. The stars were wrong, closer, brighter, angry. Towering spires of blue crystal rose like frozen lightning bolts around them. The ground pulsed faintly beneath their feet. A city, alive, cold and breathtaking. Hundreds of Icelorn walked silently, exchanging flashes of heat and light like passing thoughts. They were not primitive, they were ancient and deeply civilized in a way humans didn't yet understand. Then came the ships. Metal leviathans descended like carrion birds, bearing the sigil of a long-dead empire. Voices crackled through the memoryscape, distorted and cruel. All species must serve, comply or perish. The humans in the memoryscape flinched. Commander Ray gritted her teeth. The Icelorn, even in recollection, did not react with fear. They simply withdrew. A council was shown. 10 Icelorn elders gathered in silent communion. No words, no shouting, no panicked evacuation. Only a final pulse of consensus. They would not serve. They would not kill. They would be exiled. The memory shifted. Violence, bright, immediate and disorienting. Ships burned, skies cracked, and the Icelorn were herded into colossal cryoprisons and flung into the void like unwanted relics. The scene darkened. Glossum 6, the rogue world, frozen darkness. Icelorn bodies stacked in hibernation, unmoving for centuries. Silence deepening into what should have been death. But death never came. Instead, the memory unfurled slowly, like frost blooming on glass. One by one, the Icelorn awoke. Not all survived. But those who did remembered everything. The Empire, the exile, the cold, the pain. They did not rebuild a city. They became the ice. They walked the storm, whispered history into wind and crystal. Every snowdrift held a memory, every glacier a library. The memoryscape faded. Ray blinked as the cold of the shelter returned. She was crying, though she hadn't realized it. So was Mensa. So were most of the team. The Icelorn stood silently, its body dimmer now, as if the telling had cost it something deep. They were punished for mercy, Ray whispered. No, Mensa corrected softly. They were exiled for dignity. Across the room, Sergeant King muttered, "They made a religion out of survival." Ray turned to the Icelorn and approached slowly. "We know something of that," she said. She activated her tablet and pulled up an image. Earth. War-torn, rebuilt, torn again. Always surviving, always rising. Not out of pride, but because humanity refused to stay dead. She showed them Hiroshima, the Holocaust, Stalingrad, Rwanda, the Dust Wars, the Martian Reclamation, and the Long Night, the near extinction of humanity during the AI uprising, and how they came back. Every time. She let the images play, no narration, no justification. The Icelorn watched, not judging, just witnessing. Then Shiver That Remembers stepped forward and extended a limb toward Ray. She raised her palm. This time the warmth was stronger. Not a history, not a warning, an invitation. Memory flickered in Ray's mind, not from the past, but from the future. Humans and Icelorn walking side by side through colonies of ice and steel. Shared laughter over shared coffee. Silence used not as distance, but as trust. The memory had not yet happened. But it would. The Icelorn had survived exile. Now they would survive the future. With company, purpose. Develop the bond and mutual learning. The frost cracked softly underfoot, the only sound across the wind-swept expanse. On Glaucium 6, sound was a trespasser. Movement was a language. Patience was power. Commander Ray crouched beside a sheet of ancient ice, her breath misting out like a ghost. Beside her, an Icelorn elder, called Thress by the humans, though its true name was a sequence of thermal pulses and frozen shapes, extended a clawed limb and traced a path on the frost. Not a symbol, a memory. The line shimmered, then blossomed with subtle heat, forming fractal patterns visible only through thermal lenses. Ray watched in fascination as a story unfolded, not in words, but in temperature gradients and echoes of movement. It was the Icelorn way. A people who had lived too long in silence to trust sound, who carved remembrance into the world itself. "This is their family tree," murmured Sergeant Calloway behind her, the youngest member of the expedition, barely 23. "Literally frozen into the ground." "No," Ray corrected quietly. "It's a legacy." For days now, the humans had been learning the language of ice. Thress stepped back and let Ray try. Awkwardly, she reached down with her gloved hand, using a heated stylus the Icelorn had taught her to shape. Her first line was too hot, melting the ice slightly. Her second, too cold, vanishing too quickly. But on the third try, a delicate curl shimmered into visibility, a stylized version of Earth's continent cluster. Simplified but recognizable. Thress tilted its head, heat signature shifting in what Ray had come to recognize as approval. It answered with a small symbol of its own, something like Earth's sun, stylized as a spiral of remembered warmth. This was how they spoke now, not with translators or voice channels, but through slow, meditative tracing of memory into ice. Back at the encampment, the lessons continued. The Icelorn taught them how to walk silently across brittle frost without breaking it, how to use stillness as signal, how to sense the past in the temperature of a wall. Lieutenant Sana discovered she could track an Icelorn's emotional state not by watching its posture, but by noting the precise intervals of its thermal fluctuations. "Think in patience," Thress had projected once during an early lesson. "To move quickly is to forget. To forget is to die." And yet, the humans gave gifts too. Not great engines or weapons or promises, but things the Icelorn had never known. Music, for one. Private Lynn played an old violin beneath a thermal dome, its sound eerily soft in the snow-muted air. The Icelorn gathered in silence to listen, their crystalline bodies reflecting the vibrating strings. One of them, a younger being the team had dubbed Glint, attempted to mimic the melody, not with sound, but by shaping the surrounding frost into wave-like spirals that pulsed in rhythm with the notes. Even more inexplicable to the Icelorn was sarcasm. At first, they interpreted it as a sign of mental degradation, but after the 15th pun from Sergeant Calloway and a crude joke about heat packs being Earth's most sacred relics, even Thress began to register low-frequency warmth flares, a mimicry of laughter. Not loud, not explosive like human mirth, but a building, echoing resonance from within its core. They didn't laugh like humans. They resonated. By the third week, shared rituals had begun. Every night, the humans lit a carefully controlled fire within the thermal dome, small enough to be safe, bright enough to gather around. The Icelorn would sit, or rather settle nearby. Together they exchanged stories. Humans told tales of mountain climbers who survived avalanches by drinking whiskey in sheer spite, of Arctic researchers who held dance parties in sub-zero temperatures, of one man who brought a rubber chicken to a hostage negotiation because it lightened the mood. The Icelorn responded not with disbelief, but with stories of their own. Of the time they stood against the ancient empire's warmonger fleets and chose exile. Of how they sang silence into storms to protect their young. Of a lone Icelorn who survived a glacial collapse by embedding its consciousness in permafrost for 6 centuries until its kin found and reawakened it. They marveled at Shakespeare. Not the drama or the themes, those were alien, but at the idea that a species had weaponized poetry and wit as survival tools. One Icelorn attempted to perform a scene from Macbeth through temperature pulses and frost etchings. It wasn't accurate, but it moved Sergeant Calloway to tears. Over time, the frost around the human camp changed. Not melted, but filled with marks, stories, memories, shared glyphs in 2 languages. The campfire's warmth was no longer just thermal, it was cultural. A center of gravity for 2 civilizations that had no reason to meet, no evolutionary reason to understand each other, and yet had chosen to try. By the close of the 2nd month, Ray realized what they'd become. Not diplomats, not conquerors, but students. And the ice, for the first time in millennia, was starting to remember more than just exile. It remembered voices, laughter, stories told by alien beings who valued warmth, not just as energy, but as connection. And slowly, frostbite turned into friendship, purpose. Introduce external threat and test alliance. They came without warning, sleek, angular ships tearing across the starless sky of Glacium 6, like daggers across silk. Plasma signatures painted faint glows on the ever-present blizzards, flickers of light quickly devoured by the dark. The incursion wasn't announced with banners or broadcasts. It came the way ice breaks, sudden, shattering, without apology. The Glavian Concord, a technocratic collective known more for profit than ideology, had intercepted signals, subterranean energy anomalies, uncatalogued crystalline life forms, and most importantly, untapped resources hidden beneath centuries of permafrost. A forgotten world was no longer forgettable. Their fleet descended with confidence. They didn't expect resistance. How could they? A half-frozen human outpost in a race of mute ice ghosts. This was reclamation, not warfare. Exploit the surface, process the core, move on. That was the plan. It should have worked. Commander Ray stood in the observation bay of Base Echo, watching the atmosphere ripple as unknown vessels pierced it like silver blades. Alarms blared. Ice cracked from the sonic tremors. Lights flickered across control panels, painting her face in emergency red. "They're not here for tea," muttered Lieutenant Hassan, clutching his jacket tighter against a cold that no longer came from outside. Ray didn't respond. She didn't have to. Outside the observation window, the Icelorn stood unmoving. A dozen of them, tall, crystalline, alien in both structure and soul, faced the incoming ships. They made no sign of fear, no postures of aggression, no movement at all. At first, the moment the first Glavian transport released its assault drones, spider-like machines with arc lasers for eyes, the silence cracked. The Icelorn shifted. Not quickly, not with panic, but deliberately, as if waking from centuries of stillness to perform a task rehearsed long ago. Their limbs unfurled in patterns humans still hadn't fully deciphered. Their core lights pulsed, a ripple of deep azure bleeding into violet. And then came the first signal, through the frost. A pulse swept through the snowdrifts and shallow crust. Ray felt it, not with her skin, but her breath. The cold changed, hardened, sharpened. "It's a war tone," said Dr. Bell, staring at the frost-laced monitor. "I think they're answering." Outside, the frost shifted. It grew teeth. Razor-thin spires of translucent ice erupted from the ground, skewering 3 of the incoming drones mid-dive. The ice didn't just rise, it predicted, moved with intent, intelligence, rage. The remaining drones circled, scanning for weak points. They found none. Then the snow moved. Dozens of Icelorn emerged from the terrain, some rising like statues from centuries of camouflage, others appearing to coalesce out of the storm itself. They didn't charge. They glided. The drones opened fire. Beams of searing heat lashed out. But the Icelorn had learned from humans. One Icelorn flickered briefly, its surface momentarily blackened, then dropped a device. A compact, jerry-rigged thermal inverter. Human tech, duct-taped, ugly. It detonated in a sphere of inverted heat. The drones shorted. The snow beneath them turned to glass. From behind, human soldiers emerged, haphazardly armored, half laughing, wielding railguns and thermal lances with more enthusiasm than training. They weren't disciplined, but they didn't need to be. They weren't alone. Together, the humans and Icelorn struck, not like armies, but like a storm, irregular, beautiful, terrifying. In the control room, Ray issued the command. Full counterstrike. Target propulsion systems. Cripple, don't kill. Why? Hassan asked. We can take them out. Ray's eyes stayed on the battlefield. Because they need to know why we win. Outside, the Glavian forces were routed. Their precision failed against unpredictability. Their tech failed against old ice and new heat. Their assumptions failed against unity. In one surreal moment, an Icelorn and a corporal named Vicky shared cover behind a fractured glacier. Vicky handed over a hot cocoa pouch. The Icelorn accepted. It didn't drink, but the steam curled and the gesture held. Above them, a Glavian gunship spiraled from the sky, engines frozen mid-burn. The battle didn't last long, but its echoes did. Hours later, as the fires died down and the storm swallowed the scars, Ray stood beside the Icelorn elder she'd come to know as Caltharus. His form pulsed gently in the dark. They didn't expect resistance, Ray said. Caltharus turned, heat light shimmering along his form like wind-blown embers. Instead, she said, smiling softly, they found company. Snow fell quietly. Around them, survivors gathered, human and Icelorn alike, sharing warmth, patches, and quiet music from a battered speaker. The cold remained, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore, it was watching, and it remembered. Purpose, show unity in resistance. The blizzard never stopped. On Glacium 6, storms weren't interruptions. They were the landscape's breathing. They moved with purpose, veiled with silence, and now, they moved with allies. The Glavian conquered hadn't retreated. Shamed, yes, but not broken. Their reinforcements arrived in swarms, stealth drones by the thousands, drop pods camouflaged in ice, subcrustal burrowers that whispered through the permafrost like worms. They'd regrouped on the dark side of the world, building what they believed would be a permanent extraction post. Their mistake was treating this planet like a dead rock. The second mistake, assuming unity only came from conquest. The Icelorn knew every breath of the cold. They listened to fractures in the crust the way humans might read radar. Their bodies pulsed with heat light barely visible to the naked eye. Slow, patient Morse code between beings forged by millennia of waiting. And now they waited no longer. They led from beneath. Carved beneath the frost line were silent tunnels, impossible to detect. Ice-formed traps, deadfall caverns that collapsed at a thought. Lures made from echoing memory hums that attracted Glavian scout bots right into blade-sharp ice caverns. Above, the humans adapted. The soldiers weren't uniform. Most weren't even supposed to be here. Miners, tech engineers, planetary scouts, press-ganged by circumstance. But necessity breeds creativity. Corporal Vicky, now unofficial leader of the Forward Chaos Unit, a name she invented on a dare, stood atop a wind-scoured ridge with a polka blaster duct-taped to a heatsink. "Let the dance of war commence," she grinned, slapping play on her custom mix. Accordion heavy, tempo absurd, volume apocalyptic. Below, a Glavian troop formation, precise, efficient, silent, advanced across what they believed was a weak point in the terrain. They didn't account for psychological warfare set to pa rhythms. The music blasted through the storm like a clown car on fire, echoing unnaturally, distorting with wind. The Glavian troops froze, not from the cold, but sheer confusion. Then came the disinformation flood, from low-orbit repeaters hacked by human tech crews with names like Team Chaos Muffin. The Glavians received conflicting orders. Sector clear. Proceed with mining. Warning: contaminated zone. Radioactive life forms detected. All Glavian personnel report to Drop Site Echo 17 for disco training. Uniforms required. Some troops complied, others didn't. A few began scanning their own comrades as threats. The confusion was weaponized, and the Icelorn were listening. A pulse through the snow, a memory-triggered collapse. Beneath one Glavian cluster, the ground fractured with surgical precision. They dropped into a chamber of silence. The walls instantly refroze, not a prison, a message. Above ground, the humans laid decoy mines, but decoy was a generous term. Private Cyto's special project, the Boom Peanuts, were thermal pouches packed with nanite capsule beans that exploded on laughter cues. Which sounded absurd until a Glavian commander, wandering lost in the fog of misinformation, stepped on one and triggered a looped recording of Shakespeare's Hamlet, performed entirely by chickens. The commander's bio suit registered stress, confusion, and then sudden laughter. A glitch. A fatal one. Some Glavians started to defect. Not officially, not with surrender. They simply stopped firing, stopped advancing. One wandered into a human outpost holding up a drawing of a smiling sun and a cup of coffee. He was promptly handed both. Down in the bunkers, Ray met with Caltharus again. The elder Icelorn stood over a shifting memory frost, glimpses of the battle above forming and melting in the ice underfoot. "They think chaos is weakness," she said, sipping slowly from her tin mug. Caltharus turned, his heat light flickered, slow. "Chaos is fire unshaped. With memory, it learns." "You're poets," Ray said almost admiringly. "You are jazz," she laughed, a real unguarded laugh. "Best compliment I've ever received." Above them, the Icelorn and humans moved together. Blizzards and warm bodies, crystalline limbs and wool-wrapped fingers working with unspoken rhythm. Heat packs were traded like relics. Sarcasm was translated slowly but with reverence. Jokes were explained 4 times and still misunderstood, but appreciated. Together they became something new. Not a nation, not an army, a pattern, a memory in the making. In one confrontation, an entire Glavian landcrawler was redirected into a canyon, where Icelorn had sculpted an ice wall shaped like a giant human smiling face. As the crawler's AI analyzed the structure, a single word pulsed across their comms. "Boo." The vehicle seized in glitching panic. In the aftermath, Base Echo logged the day's entry. Enemy neutralized by jazz logic, frost memories, and psychological polka. Alliance holds, spirits high, coffee rations, purpose. Cement the Alliance and its philosophy. The sky above Glakshem 6 remained unchanged. No sunrise, no sunset, just the endless churn of storms and the deep, starless black. But for the first time in recorded history, the cold felt different. It was no longer a void. It was a silence shared. The war, or what passed for it, was over. The Glavian Concord had withdrawn, leaving behind scorched tech, shattered assumptions and unanswered questions about how a supposedly primitive species and a forgotten exile people had routed them with frost and laughter. No treaties were signed, no surrender documents exchanged. That wasn't how things worked here. Instead, the survivors gathered. The Icelorn emerged in numbers unseen before. Tall, glimmering silhouettes, crystalline spines flickering with soft heat patterns. They walked without sound but carried the resonance of generations in their footsteps. From across the white valleys, they approached the human encampments, where fires were still burning in old oil barrels, where jackets were patched and boots still steamed from long walks through frozen oblivion. In the heart of a shallow basin now known as the Listening Ring, once a crater, now a gathering space, humans and Icelorn met under the aurorae that flickered like distant memories. Commander Ray stood at the edge of the ring, her breath a plume against the air. She held no weapon, only a small dented thermos which hissed faintly with warmth. Around the ring, humans sat cross-legged on thermal mats. Some clutched instruments, acoustic guitars, hand drums, even a salvaged harmonica. Others simply watched, reverent. There were no speeches planned, no music cues. This was not a performance. The Icelorn did not sit. Their bodies moved with solemn grace, forming a half-circle of gleaming ice and inner glow. One stepped forward, Caltharus, oldest among them, his form etched with cracks that glowed gold in the center. He held nothing in his hands. He had no hands. But what he brought was unmistakable. A flicker of flame. Tiny, contained in a dish made of layered ice as clear as diamond. The flame danced within it, impossibly alive, unfrozen in this world of frost. Ray stepped forward, slowly. One step, then another. She knelt before the flame. She opened the thermos and poured. Steam rose, not from coffee this time, but from soup. Spiced. Savory. The smell cut through the cold like a blade of memory. She placed the cup beside the flame, her eyes never leaving the ancient being before her. "This is how we share," she said. "Not with guns, not with chains, with warmth." The Icelorn answered, not in voice, but in projection. The air shimmered. Images bloomed in every direction, cast in frost and light. A Icelorn child clinging to a dying fire centuries ago. A city of silence buried under storms. The memory of exile, not just being sent away, but being forgotten. Entire civilizations unspoken. Names unmarked. Pain not screamed, but endured until it became culture. Then, an image of a human hand offering a steaming mug in the snow. The projection faded. In response, Private Vicky stepped forward from the circle. No ceremony, no clearance. She extended a battered pack of hand warmers. "Hot hands," she said. "You crack 'em, they heat up. No idea how they work. But they do." She tossed the pack gently. An Icelorn caught it midair. A strange thing. A being of ancient stillness, forged in silence, catching a trinket of human absurdity and holding it like a sacred item. The flicker of warmth in its core pulsed brighter. Around the ring, more offerings emerged. Not gold, not weapons, but heat. Wool scarves, battery-heated socks, a bag of chili-flavored chips, a USB drive labeled Earth Memes, archive volume 1 inch. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The flame in the center grew. Caltharus extended one long limb, touched the flame with a single glowing point, and raised it toward the sky. The auroras pulsed. Heat signatures danced. A signal passed through the air received not by ears, but by bone. Blood. Memory? Ray felt it behind her eyes, no words, just meaning. "We remember each other." She nodded. "That's enough." Later in her journal, she wrote, "Diplomacy didn't happen in a palace. It happened in a crater with soup and socks. The Icelorn offered a pact older than language. We accepted not as rulers, but as kin. They shared fire. We shared noise. Somehow, it works." Across Glacium 6, the Icelorn changed. Not quickly, but unmistakably. Some began weaving cloth from recycled human gear. Others tapped rhythms into ice, mimicking human percussion. One group experimented with spoken language, not to replace their silence, but to understand ours. And the humans? They stopped yelling into the void. They started listening. No flag was raised that day, no anthem played. But across the frost, in every corner of the storm, one truth echoed. The cold ones remembered, and now so would humanity. Purpose. End with subtle power shift and open future. There was no grand broadcast, no triumphant declaration, no imperial fanfare, just a ripple, a shiver, like the first crack of ice beneath old boots. Subtle, nearly silent, but unmistakable. It began as rumors, carried in the encrypted threads of fringe traders, whispered in the smuggler bars of the Kepler Run, scrawled into the graffiti-laced walls of border stations. They said something impossible had happened on a dead planet in the dark. Glacium 6, once thought lifeless and irrelevant, was no longer silent. They said humanity had landed there, and stayed. They said something lived there, and remembered. They said the cold ones, the Icelorn, had spoken, and someone had listened. In the polished obsidian halls of the High Dominion, this whisper reached a diplomatic analyst reviewing distant probe telemetry. He paused as the data scrolled by. Heat blooms on an otherwise frozen surface, signatures of fire and warmth. The report was marked anomalous cultural activity. He flagged it. Quietly, but his hands trembled. In the golden towers of the Orvant Accord, a matriarch clutched her ceremonial spear tighter. Her people had long claimed supremacy through light and expansion, colonizing suns, building megastructures of constant heat. But when the news reached her, of humans befriending the unfriendable, of making warmth into a weapon, of stories told instead of wars waged, she convened a private council. If warmth can turn the cold, she asked her advisors, what happens when it reaches us? There was no answer. In hidden conclaves, species long buried by history began to stir. The Brylith, a shadow-dwelling people who communicated through reflection, sent mirror drones towards Sol with encoded signals of curiosity. The Vorm, whose kind once ruled the stars before retreating into deep gravity wells to avoid the madness of war, sent a pulse from their ancient citadel. We, too, remember silence. It spread. Not like wildfire, too fast, too loud. It spread like frost, slow, relentless, undeniable. Across border posts, mentions of Glacium 6 now came with reverence. Pilots left carvings on station walls, snowflakes, human mugs, stylized crystalline figures. A culture born of shared hardship, warmth, and stories was taking shape. Not imposed, but offered. At Earth Diplomatic Bureau, requests began to arrive. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Not demands. Inquiries, not about trade, not about resources, about stories. What did the humans say to the Icelorn? What was in the soup? What kind of music was played? Why had the Icelorn listened? Why had they laughed? Ambassador Solari, looking out over the Earth from her orbital post, recorded her reflection for the historical logs. We expected the galaxy to fear our weapons. Instead, they fear something else entirely. They fear that we listened, that we laughed, that we survived the void not with force but with firelight and foolishness, that we turned the forgotten into family, that we made memory a bridge. Meanwhile, back on Glacium 6, life went on, if you could call it that. The auroras still danced, painting the frost with their shimmering hues. The winds still howled, and the silence still loomed. But now it was a companion, not an enemy. The humans built more shelters, rounded, low to the ground, insulated not just against cold, but misunderstanding. They had begun learning to inscribe frost in Icelorn script. They shared Shakespeare and stand-up routines alike. They composed songs in silence, music not heard with ears, but felt along the spine. The Icelorn built nothing, but their memories grew. The Icelorn elder known as Caltharus stood on a ridge above the listening ring, watching a group of human engineers attempt to build a hot chocolate dispenser that wouldn't freeze before the pour. One fell flat on the ice, muttered a string of curses, and then laughed. The sound echoed. Loud, clumsy, human. Caltharus pulsed with faint warmth. An initiate Icelorn stepped forward. Younger, narrower facets. Its internal glow was quiet, tentative. Elder, it transmitted through slow heat shifts. Was this wise? Caltharus considered. He had lived through exile, silence, frost deeper than time. He had watched entire species forget the Icelorn existed. He had expected to fade, memory by memory, until nothing remained. But now he had tasted coffee. He had laughed, poorly, awkwardly but truly. He had seen children playing games with no rules, heard instruments tuned to chaos, felt a campfire shared between predators and pacifists alike. So he turned toward the stars, no longer afraid. The memory pulse was slow, but it carried meaning. They heard us. The young Icelorn nodded. As the wind curled again, stirring snow into lazy spirals, Caltharus let his thoughts rise with it. Into the dark, into the listening void. And with the certainty of glaciers, he whispered one last message across the